Hi, everybody. It's 2:30 in London. We are just waiting for a few more people to enter the webinar, so we'll start in about a minute. Thanks for your patience. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tom Keating. I'm Director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here at RUSI in London, and it's my great pleasure to be the moderator of today's webinar. Before getting started, just ask if you could absorb the housekeeping points on the screen and note that the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded. If you want to ask a question, do please pose it in the now standard way in the Q&A box, and do please include your name and organizational affiliation, just so we get a sense of where you are coming from with your question. So by way of background, we established our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here at RUSI in 2014 with the aim of studying issues at the intersection of finance and security, and not just related to criminal finances, but also the way finance can be put to malign use. So it's therefore my great pleasure today to welcome our panelists, who will start to reveal themselves and who come from both sides of the Atlantic. And we're going to discuss just that particular challenge, the way finance can be put to malign use, and the ways in which a smarter understanding of financial flows can help governments and their private sectors, importantly, secure the integrity of democracies and their democratic processes from abuse by malign finance. So with us to debate the issue of dark money and democracy and fathom whether there is a way out are firstly Josh Rudolph, who's joining us from the US, and he is the Fellow for Malign Finance at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and author of the recent paper, Covert Foreign Money, Financial Loopholes Exploited by Authoritarians to Fund Political Interference in Democracies, a paper I wish I had written, but Josh has done a great job with that research. Secondly, Edward Lucas, who's a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, is an independent analyst, campaigner, commentator, and regular writer on malign finance. And thirdly, Gemma Rogers, who's co-founder of the fintech-focused financial crime consultancy FinTrail, and beneficiary of a range of other relevant experiences for today's conversation. So our plan for the hour is that each panelist will speak for up to 10 minutes, with Josh sharing the key points from his recent paper, Edward providing his perspectives from the UK side of the Atlantic, and Gemma offering some thoughts from her vantage point in the private sector. We'll then turn to discussion and Q&A. So again, do please be sure to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. In the interest of democracy, we have switched on the upvote function in the Q&A. So if you particularly like a question, then do please give it a thumbs up, and we will try and be democratic about the questions we select. Anyway, with all that said, I would now like to turn the floor over to Josh, who is going to share some slides and provide some insights into his recent paper. Josh, welcome. Floor is yours, as they say.
Well, hello, and thank you for that nice introduction. You know, it was 4 years ago when we first heard unconfirmed suggestions that Russia is behind the DNC hack. We had no idea then about their troll farms or intrusions into state election systems. This year, as we wonder what Russia might be up to, the most underappreciated external threat to American democracy is covert foreign money. Over the past decade, Russia, China, and other authoritarians have funneled more than $300 million into 33 countries to interfere in democracy more than 100 times. About half of the cases involve Russia operating in Europe, from financing separatists in eastern Ukraine to funding big donors to the Tory party in London. And it's a global phenomenon too, targeting Africa, North America, the Asia Pacific. It's also getting worse. It used to be just 2 to 3 new cases per year, but with sweeping campaigns launched in the middle of the last decade, there's now 15 to 30 new cases in each of the last 4 or 5 years of loans to a French political party, oil profits in Italy, material support for a German lawmaker, payments to a Dutch think tank turned political party, cultivation of far-right news websites in Sweden. On our side of the pond, US officials used to think that this is a problem for Europe, but this year, the US officials say that Russia's new tools for the November election could include 3 offline tactics of financial interference. They also say that Russia hits countries that have legal loopholes allowing foreign assistance. And while US officials have not disclosed which countries or loopholes, that's exactly what our research project has endeavored to establish over the past year. Whereas most comparative research on covert foreign money starts with the policies, surveying, for example, gaps in campaign finance laws, we hope that ours is relevant because it's more empirical. It starts by defining and surveying the known bad activity. We dig into the legal avenues exploited in each instance, and group the 100 plus cases into the most commonly exploited legal loopholes. And then finally, we recommend policy solutions that we developed in consultation with almost 100 current and former executive branch officials, congressional staffers on both parties, constitutional law scholars, civil society experts. And the name of the game there was to scope the solutions just right so that they do close off channels of foreign financial interference, but without also infringing on the speech rights of domestic political spenders or just jeopardizing bipartisan support. Our 73-page report is structured around with a chapter for each of the 7 most exploited loopholes, plus an 8th chapter on illegality. But starting with the first loophole at the top, it's not financial per se, but it operates similarly and it falls within gaps in campaign finance law, so we include it. Russian oligarchs have bankrolled secret lavish gifts in Switzerland or package deals for African leaders. In the United States, a related loophole opens the door for intangible things of value, which, because they're hard to quantify, the Justice Department has effectively allowed President Trump and his proxies to seek from foreign governments in 2 consecutive presidential elections, dirt on opponents, hacking of emails, black market media services, agricultural purchases in swing states, foreign investigations into political rivals. This could be addressed by stronger enforcement, which you could either criminally send a memo to all of the U.S. attorneys about how they should broadly enforce the foreign source ban, or for civil enforcement, there's a draft interpretive rule at the Federal Election Commission that would similarly recognize a broad scope of a thing of value. But the most durable reform would be for Congress to write that broad definition just straight into the law, which I do expect the House of Representatives to take up in a couple of months from now in their next version of what's called the SHIELD Act in the United States. And that bill would also address the second vulnerability highlighted by our research, which is human intermediaries. The SHIELD Act would make campaigns report to law enforcement offers of assistance from foreign powers, because we have 27 examples around the world of authoritarians sending people on secret missions to support favored politicians. This is not limited to Russians at Trump Tower, or even the most problematic case, as you well know, in London, or series of cases. Human intermediaries are also China's tool of choice, sending straw donors to Australia and New Zealand. And in the United States, the biggest known case of foreign financial support in the 2016 election had nothing to do with Russia or China or Trump. It was the Emiratis apparently funding a clandestine operation to buy potential influence with Hillary Clinton. We have some tweaks that we would make to the SHIELD Act, but the point is that It would meet the threat by narrowly requiring campaign contact reporting of foreign powers offering help, while also protecting the political rights of Americans to interact with campaigns and the rights of campaigns to engage in benign foreign relations. And we've got similarly tailored proposals for corporate conduits for political spending, like shell companies and nonprofits. And there are also covert methods of funding online political ads, fringe media outlets, crypto donor bots. And lastly, sometimes it's not a legal loophole, it's just a crime committed. In those cases, that boldness is often reflective of strategic priorities set at the highest levels, and we have detailed reporting around that within the perpetrating regimes. So we discuss that in our work in the context of multi-vector regional influence campaigns. So that's our policy research, but let me just finish with two points around why this is so hard to fix politically and how that could potentially change soon. First, the hardest part is not, frankly, what we've done, which is coming up with these policy solutions. The hardest part is that the politicization of foreign interference has become the biggest obstacle to addressing it, at least in the United States. These operations are designed to pit citizens against each other and get us to distrust our institutions. The single strongest move that we could make would be to say that this is not about any one candidate or party. It's about the integrity of our democracy. It's a life or death matter of national security. It has to come before all personal or partisan loyalties, because we're all, in our case, Americans or Britons. And lastly, I have to say, let me just stop my screen share here. You know, when I started this research project a year ago, we said that it is covert foreign money, the top unrecognized threat to democracy. When I was putting finishing touches on it a month or two ago, I had to tweak that statement to say that it's the most underappreciated external risk. Because let's be honest, the gravest threat of authoritarianism destroying American democracy is now coming from within our own borders. And that, of course, has to be our top priority nationally over the next month or two. However, after that, I can tell you from the reception that we've received to this research on both sides of the aisle in Washington, D.C., a historic window may be about to open where we can really build resilience to authoritarianism, including this essential financial component. Similarly, perhaps to just in the 7 weeks that followed 9/11 in 2001, the US government enacted the most sweeping anti-money laundering overhaul in a generation, prioritized Treasury's fight against terrorist financing, and persuaded 30 countries through the FATF to impose similar financial security protections, all within just 7 weeks. So we can do a lot fast when we work together as a nation and as allies. And I think that it's possible that it's not certainly not certain, but possible that in a year from now, we will have closed many of these loopholes in the United States on a bipartisan basis, and then also secured country commitments at a summit for democracy that one of the two presidential candidates in the United States is pledged to host within his first year in office. And two of the three pillars at that summit are going to be fighting corruption and defending our elections from authoritarianism, including foreign money. Now, in order to get all of that work done within the next year, we've got to explain the urgency, hold hearings in parliaments and Congress, draft legislation, incorporate public feedback. In the United States, we've got to get Treasury and the FEC into the fight, coordinate throughout the interagency, get the allies on board, and put the adversaries on notice. And the aim of this research is, and conversations like this, is to jumpstart that work. So thank you for following it closely. Please do read the research and get in touch if you have ideas on implementation. And I really look forward to this discussion.
Josh, thank you very much for those first thoughts. I'm interested in the point you make about closing loopholes in the US. When the US puts its mind to things, it can get things done. But perhaps let's get a perspective from this side of the Atlantic now by turning to Edward. Edward, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And first of all, I just want to commend Josh's report and urge everyone watching this to read it from beginning to end and to reflect on how it applies to whatever country you are in when you're reading it. I wanted to make a couple of conceptual points and then talk a bit about the Russia report from the Intelligence and Security Committee, and then look at possible countermeasures that we can take against our foreign money. I think there's a fundamental difference between people who are trying to buy influence within a functioning political system and people who are trying to attack the functioning of the political system. Rich people have been trying to buy political influence since the dawn of democracy. It's bad. We should always be trying to level the playing field. But I think there's a category difference between someone saying, I want the next US administration to be nice to Ruritania and bad to Sildavia, or vice versa, and people who are saying, let's attack democracy because we don't want the United States or Britain or whichever country it is to have political willpower and to pursue its goals. And maybe we want to make Western democracy look bad so that our own sham democracy looks no worse, or maybe even less hypocritical. So I think there's a kind of category difference with in the kind of attacks we've seen particularly from Russia over the last few years. That's not to say the other problems aren't grave and need to be dealt with, but there's a sort of particular nihilistic, destructive streak to the Russian attacks that we need to worry about. Now, I was the first witness to the Intelligence and Security Committee inquiry into Russia. That was in summer of 2019. And there were many scandals about that. It was a scandal that it took so long to get going. There was a lot of foot dragging in the Cabinet Office. It was a scandal that they didn't get the cooperation from the intelligence and security agencies that they should have had, which they expected. There was a scandal that the report took so long to come out. It was meant to come out before Christmas. And there's also the scandal that since it came out, its recommendations haven't been acted on. But I was particularly struck by the way in which the security service appeared not to have grasped the issue of foreign interference in our democracy, and particularly the issue of dark money. And I think that within government, we've got a real problem that we don't have the focus on a kind of financial intelligence service that focuses on the interplay between money and hostile state activity. And we urgently need that. And I really hope that in the new defense review that's going on, the integrated security review, that someone really grasps this, and whether it ends up with the SIS or Thames House with the security service, or with a beefed up treasury, someone in the heart of government has really got to get to grips with the way in which money is a vector of hostile influence. And it's absolutely clear from the Intelligence and Security Committee report that that hasn't happened, and that this has been exploited against us. It's worth noting, I think, that Alex Younger, the outgoing chief of SIS, says that he doesn't think that anything Russia's done has actually had strategic significance, but the vulnerability is there. And even if it didn't swing an election or a referendum last time, that's no reason for complacency, because it can be used against us in future. What can we do about it? Well, one thing I think we need to do is to look very carefully at Australia. Australia has passed the toughest package of laws on countering foreign influence, I think, of any advanced democracy. And within the context of Five Eyes and Five Eyes Plus structures dealing with political threats to democracy, I think we really need to look very carefully at how Australia's using these laws. It may well be that there's a degree of overshoot, or maybe there's a degree of undershoot, but this is a really important experiment. Anyone watching this can Google what Australia's done. It's been well described in the New York Times and other news outlets. But for example, it criminalizes the interference with the democratic right or duty of an Australian citizen. And that's something quite different from unlike anything we have in this country, and goes well beyond American style FARA requirements. But at a minimum, we should be adopting the American Foreign Agent Registration Act requirements, but we could be going a great deal further. I think there's several different ways we can go on from that. The legal side is only part of it. I think the normative pressure is very important. And in the end, politicians are more likely to steer clear of things, not because they're outright illegal, but because they're morally questionable and will lose them votes. The law in the end is a backstop, but the front stop is social normative pressure. And I think we need to do a lot to encourage politicians, political parties to say they don't take money from dodgy sources, and that taking money from dodgy sources, even if it's strictly speaking legal, is going to get you into trouble and lose votes. And there's a lot we can do, whether we're journalists or think tanks or campaigners or whatever, to try and increase that level of pressure. We may also need to look at state funding of political parties. I've always been against that, but political influence is very cheap in this country. I think the entire British general election last time round cost less than one Senate race in America. And so the temptation is there. If one increases political funding German style, that maybe displaces the some of the temptation of taking dirty foreign money, also keeping the cost of politics quite low, preventing cost inflation that increases dependence on foreign money is important. But there's one particular thing that I think we need to look at, which I'm going to finish up on, which is the question of corporate anonymity. This is a real curse. It may be that you can't directly give money into the political system from a shell company, but shell companies are a kind of breach in the gate, from which all sorts of things can happen. You can hire politicians' relatives, give them sinecures through a shell company. You can purchase the sort of things that are then given as gifts in kind. And I think we've really got to think very hard about the question of beneficial ownership. This was picked up by the Cameron government during the coalition years, but then dropped. And the progress has been extremely slow in this country since then. I think we should be saying this: if you want limited liability, that is a privilege, and limited liability should be conditional on having the beneficial ownership absolutely clear. If you have reasons to conceal your identity, well, maybe you do, but you can't then expect to have limited liability, and you may find it more difficult for people to do business with you. I think that the danger with trying piecemeal reform is that the bad guys have very expensive lawyers and will tend to try and find ways round laws, rather like rich people always find ways of evading taxes. So I think we probably need some pretty radical thinking on the question of shell companies. That won't be a sufficient condition for cleaning up the political system, but I think it's certainly a necessary one. I could expand on these, but I'd rather look forward to the Q&A, and also I'm dying to hear what Gemma has to say, so I'll stop there.
Right, well, thank you, Edward. Well, let's put you out of your misery. Gemma, and actually there's a question already in about, what can the private sector be doing in the context of all this. Ultimately, it is the private sector that's generally moving the money. It's not duffel bags of cash being deposited sort of narco style to the same degree. So what are the thoughts from the private sector side?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and something I think private companies need to start thinking about in a lot more detail. So yeah, I'm just going to sort of dive into a few sort of practical steps that firms can take to try and think about this issue and address it in a bit more detail than I think has been done thus far. So I think the first point that I would make is it's really important for private sector firms, particularly financial institutions, to educate themselves around this type of threat. I think what I've seen quite commonly from consulting experience and my experience working in financial institutions is there isn't always a particularly strong connection between compliance teams and the kind of geopolitical teams, the geopolitical risk teams that exists, particularly in those kind of large traditional financial institutions. And we don't always necessarily make those connections between how the work of compliance teams, anti-financial crime teams is sort of really affected by those wider geopolitical shifts, trends and currents that are ongoing. I would really echo Edward's thoughts about Josh's paper. I think that's an absolutely critical read for anyone working kind of in this space, and it's a really good start point to kind of familiarize yourself with the threat, and then of course go into the paper and dive into a lot more detail. I think the thing that struck me when reading it was, as you were alluding to, Tom, these companies that are funding influence campaigns and what have you have bank accounts somewhere. Banks are moving this money around the world in some way, shape or form. So banks need to take very seriously what risks they're running and potentially doing so, and actually even understanding whether that is what they are doing. Do they even know that that is what they are getting involved in? And that's something that I'm not sure is totally clear. So understanding what exposure they have, understanding the issue, I think is absolutely critical. I think then on this sort of wider education point and talking about financial institutions and others really educating themselves around this issue, I think there is, go back to the broader point of connecting geopolitical risk teams with compliance teams. If as a compliance officer, you don't understand regionalized issues of corruption, geopolitical currents and relationships between countries, and those kind of foreign policy strategies of individual countries, particularly those that have anti-money laundering failings, or on FATF blacklists, or are running kind of autocratic regimes that are seeking to influence and subvert democracies around the world, how will anti-financial crime teams be able to spot the actual behavior that they're seeing kind of in transactional and illicit flows if they don't have that context? I think it's absolutely critical that they understand that kind of wider background picture and that landscape that we're operating in. I think it's really easy in the sort of compliance world to think that financial crime happens in a way that we can perfectly manage with these kind of perfectly tuned transaction monitoring rule sets, and that money moves around the world in these kind of rigid sort of structures that criminals utilize to sort of funnel money around the world. But the reality is, like, financial crime it's very hard to manage for large institutions. It takes a lot of effort to spot any kind of financial crime activity, and this one in particular is this sort of malign finance is particularly challenging, I think, to identify. So making sure you've got a really robust approach to identifying new typologies and new ways of moving money around the world illicitly is absolutely critical. And in my mind, the things that are really important here are completing really detailed reactive investigations into those large scale cases where you have concerns, delving deeply into ultimate beneficial ownership, delving deeply into who these people are connected to, but then also completing proactive investigations. This is absolutely critical. So kind of diving into areas where you maybe have some information, some management information, some high level statistics that kind of just don't feel right. You have maybe accounts where you're pushing money through, or money is flowing through at a rate that is not commensurate with the size and scale of that company, and sort of really analysing those outlier type companies within your book is absolutely critical. It's then really key to make sure that the intelligence from those investigations is fed back into your KYC and onboarding controls, and also your transaction monitoring controls that you've got in place, because without that, you're not going to then be able to stop it when it probably continues to happen. I think a final point I would make on this kind of connection between geopolitical risk and compliance risk is clearly geopolitical risk at the broadest level has a massive impact on something like sanctions. So there's a really kind of simple connection that I think needs to be made between firms that have these two different teams in place to make sure that the information flows between those teams work effectively. I think for a lot of smaller firms, so this sort of firms that we work with at my company, I don't think geopolitical risk is even a thing for many of them. And I think making it the responsibility of somebody, whether that's an outsourced firm or maybe sitting it within a strategy team or a risk management team, is really important, so that you as the CEO of that firm really understand where your potential exposure, potential issues might be, is really important. And then finally, kind of one that's, I think, applicable across the board is thinking about your kind of risk appetite. Again, being aware that this is an issue and thinking about whether or not as a financial services firm you have a risk appetite for any of this activity and where those boundaries lie, what you're happy to get involved with, does that affect your country risk ratings, those kinds of things, I think is very important. And factoring in this kind of anti-democratic and sort of anti-corruption angle into those country risk assessments and those risk appetites, I think is a good way forward. I think another area that it's important to focus on is due diligence. It goes without saying that firms need to do due diligence on the customers that they take on. So particularly financial institutions, they are in most cases regulatorily required to do so. But I also think it's very important that this kind of diligence is done on investors, and this goes particularly for the startup and fintech space. It is absolutely vital to understand where the money that you're taking from investors is coming from. We know that financial institutions are a part of critical national infrastructure. We know, we've seen the Wirecard scandal. We know that they can kind of be potentially utilised for nefarious purposes, and that they play a really significant role in our economies. And therefore, you know, looking at the money that's flowing into those firms to support them, prop them up, get them started is vital. And when I say due diligence here, I'm not just talking about checking your PEP and sanctions lists. I'm talking about really digging into the backgrounds of these individuals. Does their investment into your company actually make sense? Is it commensurate with other items in their portfolio? And what are their connections to kind of politics, autocratic regimes, if they are from sort of some of these, what I would call high risk jurisdictions. I also think it's important not to outsource this risk. So what I've seen happen quite a bit is that firms will kind of say, well, there's a venture capitalist firm that's recommended this particular investor, so happy to kind of take them on, and they kind of assume that they're clean. But that isn't necessarily going to be the case. You have to have your own risk appetite around this kind of thing, and about knowing your investors and who they are, and effectively who you're doing business with. So again, making sure you've got time in your investment process to do this, making sure you've got the right staff in place, whether that's in your compliance team or again supported by external firms, is really critical, and helps you make sure that you're not going to take money from someone where they do have this kind of malign influence. Another sort of the third area that I think firms should really focus on is information sharing. We need to really focus between and among private sector and financial services companies, that there is information flowing between and among them about how illicit money is flowing through the financial system. In my view, is kind of one of the only ways we're going to stem the tide of dark money. We have this constant source of intelligence, of financials, of reporting, whether that's suspicious activity reports, suspicious transaction reports, or other cases. That is all knowledge that we have, and I believe very strongly that we need to start sharing that more openly. From my experience, it's not really a technological issue that's preventing that sharing. I think some areas have focused quite heavily on have we got privacy enhancing technology, etc., to do so. I don't think that's the case. I think the technology is there. I actually think it's the legal basis and justification for doing so that really blocks this from happening. If you, in my view, conduct careful data protection impact assessments, then I think it is possible to share that type of information. And at the very least, if you're not able to share what we would term in Europe as PII, personally identifiable information, with other financial institutions, then at least sharing the typologies that you're seeing, as we do in Gimlet and the FinTech FinCrime Exchange, will definitely have some impact. And then just a very quick final point from me is that I completely agree with Edward on this point about having this notion of Fintel, like a fintelligence organization. We need to kind of bring together these spheres of intelligence and finance much more closely and work together, and use kind of the brilliant skills we have in the intelligence world with the brilliant skills that we have in the finance world, to bring those together, understand how geopolitics, malign finance come together and are affecting whether it's critical national infrastructure or national security. I think the ISC report was an excellent report, notwithstanding the issues with its production that Edward noted. But I think, you know, that's really, for me, kind of just a start point, and I think we should be doing a lot more of that work going forward. So, but for now, that's it from me.
Great, Gemma, thank you very much. You started off by sort of talking about how the private sector needs to educate itself. You, I think, echo something I agree with, and Edward mentioned well about this kind of situational awareness using financial intelligence to assist with that. Josh, I want to come to you with the first question. Is in doing the research for your paper, what did you learn about countries' abilities, the United States' ability to actually exploit financial intelligence? Are there things that we should be learning from what happens in the US in that regard?
I'm thinking, I mean, maybe to some degree, we did have around interference in our election broadly, obviously the Mueller report, although, you know, that was good and independent and robust in a number of ways, almost in every way except for money. So, you know, we still in the United States have not had investigations by either DOJ or FBI or the Senate into, you know, really following the money around 2016 on either side of the aisle. You know, on that side, it's, you know, possible laundering through real estate and decades-long ties to Moscow, some big Russian expat donors that we have, you know, funding through Deutsche Bank or the NRA. We don't have answers on any of those things. So we ourselves need to really ramp up and coordinate. And we have proposals for how exactly to do that, you know, creating hybrid threat centers in the intelligence community, and then getting the policy workers to work together through our National Security Council and getting Treasury and the FEC into it. So we have a lot to do, and we are learning from, for example, the ISC report I thought was very helpful from the parliamentary perspective in starting the conversation about the financial vector and the elite expat donors. It would be great if we did something like that here on the US side. It's just so politicized. And I should say on the other side in 2016 as well. I mentioned that case of the Emiratis apparently funding a secret mission to buy influence with Hillary Clinton. Even though we got some information and an indictment, it was, again, everything but the money. They did not actually charge the operatives of receiving funding from the UAE, even though they caught them with all their WhatsApp messages, you know, talking to each other in very slightly coded language about the money, which they called the baklava, that was coming from their source, their bakery in their redacted foreign city. So you've got like all the evidence, but we've struggled on both sides, and we really need to ramp up as well.
Okay. Edward, a question for you, picking up on a couple of questions from participants. We're obviously here, this has been quite an Anglosphere conversation, UK, US. What's your perspective on where things stand amongst EU countries, for example, or indeed someone has asked around, you know, countries like Moldova, Georgia, you know, if you like, countries where perhaps have less robust systems than we think we have in the US and in the UK. They must be very vulnerable, even more vulnerable than we are here.
Yes, I think that the position in Moldova and Georgia is really bleak, and only the libel laws prevent me from being even blunter. But the political influence is very underpriced, and people with very lucrative connections to business in the Russian Federation can buy not just political parties, but the entire political system. I think in Ukraine, the sort of de-oligarchization, if one can call it that, of the Ukrainian political system has proceeded in 2 steps forwards and probably two steps back, and it's not particularly encouraging what's going on there at the moment. There's also a very substantial overlap between wealth and political power in Hungary, which is a source of grave concern to people who watch that country. Elsewhere, things are a bit brighter, I think, and one sees quite vigorous contests that are not based on who owns the biggest bank or the biggest oil company. And I think people watch with some dismay at what's happening in what used to be seen as the world's most important democracy, the United States, and the world's oldest democracy, this country. And those who follow Lithuanian politics can take some comfort from the way in which the Lithuanian election, first round, happened yesterday, was fought. So I think democracy is alive and well in some other countries, but the overall danger is absolutely of this of dark money filtering in imperceptibly, where it's not even where you can't see it. Sometimes you can smell it. But I think that it's odd. We used to worry about whether so-called Eastern Europe would manage to meet Western standards. We now worry very much about the Western standards and perhaps a bit less about the region we used to call Eastern Europe.
Good point. Yes, I sometimes wonder whether there is such a concept as sort of sleeper money. It's there until it needs to be activated. Gemma, I just want to come to you. A lot of my perception is a lot of the good stuff, the value-added stuff that the private sector does around dark money and illicit finance is actually voluntary. It's going the extra mile and conducting investigations which you may not actually need to necessarily conduct. And it would seem that this is an area which you could put under that category of voluntary. Am I being unfair? And if there is a kernel of truth in what I'm saying, how do you get the financial institution to do the voluntary stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think to some extent it's maybe voluntary. It's not quite the word I'd use. Maybe there's like self-interest. Self-interested is maybe the word I would use. So I think in a lot of cases they may not regulatorily be required to look into some of this sort of stuff more deeply. But it's in their interest too, because if they don't, then further down the line they might get kind of clobbered with regulatory fines and issues and what have you. And but I think in order to kind of change perspectives, I think it genuinely is this education point and understanding the importance of the role that these financial institutions play in society and how they connect to these kind of wider institutions of democracy. And so on and so forth. And I don't think that kind of link is always well understood. I think there's like a huge focus from shareholders on profits and what have you, and that's the world we live in. It's a capitalist economy, etc. So we're never going to get rid of that. But I think recognizing that financial institutions play a wider societal role, not just in serving their customers, but also in the provision of services that they offer, and the sort of power they have because of how money makes the world go round, quite literally, the criminal one too, I think is really important. So I don't, in terms of how you actually get them to do that, I think in some ways that maybe it has to come from sort of this activist investor type community, and maybe it has to come from pressure from sort of the regulators, and that's where having sort of this more fintelligence, that's my awful name for it, I'm sure that's not going to get taken up, but this kind of fintelligence approach to how we tackle this threat could help kind of apply both the necessary pressure on these organizations in the same way that I think fines and what have you have pressured financial institutions to improve their anti-money laundering controls, but could also provide really useful intelligence that supports them in that activity. So it's a little bit more carrot and stick rather than just stick all the time, because I think that kind of solely, well, do this or you get fined, that doesn't create, in my view, a completely sustainable financial services system. I think you've got to have a little bit more balance in there, and I think that would be a great way of doing it.
Edward, you want to come in?
Yes, I'm a bit sceptical about the fines, given the size of the companies that we need to persuade to do differently. These fines are sort of basically pretty trivial, and I think we need to rethink both the carrots but also the sticks. And I worry very much that we don't seem to send anyone in this country to jail for any kind of white collar crime, particularly not from big financial institutions or big professional services firms. And I don't think that's because nobody's doing anything wrong. I think it's because our financial crime prosecution is woefully underpowered. And I think we need to rethink that for lots of reasons. But one of them is that it's so corrosive for democracy.
And can I just add, picking up on that and tying back to that previous question as well, this is one area, enforcement and the size of the fines to a degree that they're motivating, that the United States has been relatively better over the past decade, looking at multi-billion-dollar fines for violations on sanctions and terrorist financing and other compliance. We have done some financial enforcement.
I think that's Josh, that's a valid point. Some people would suggest that the fines tend to be directed at the people over there on the other side of the Atlantic rather than within the US necessarily. But you did say something in your remarks which held out a possible note of hope, which is that there is perhaps there could be an opportunity for, I think you talked about this kind of gathering of the democracies. And so what is it in the US? Well, two questions. Firstly, what is it in the US that is going to actually make people take this issue seriously? But secondly, do we think that will be followed through on? And then I'm going to come to Ed, and which addresses one of the comments or the questions, which is kind of the UK is good at getting so far down this road, but then doesn't actually follow through. The UK tends to be all talk and no action. So are we going to see action in the US on this? And then to Edward, how do we follow through on action in the UK? So Josh, to you first.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the two presidential candidates has this summit for democracy that he would host within the first year, and two of the three pillars there are fighting authoritarianism, including financial interference in elections, and corruption. And actually, I think that's a useful set of two priorities, and I would kind of describe each of them differently. And in the report, we talk about how malign finance, it's politically oriented. It's about having political goals rather than goals of enrichment. So it's a little bit different than corruption, even though it often operates through channels of corruption. But in terms of how we could see action, if we think about this in the States, if we think about this differently, on authoritarian interference, it is very salient, at least to half of our country right now and over the past 4 years. And that's going to be the big job of the next year, is to get it more than half and to really see it on a bipartisan basis and bring the country together on that as a national security threat. On corruption, I would argue, and others have said as well, offers the opportunity to make American foreign and domestic policy consistent with each other for, frankly, the first time in a generation, really since Cold War containment. For the first time, we have, with high levels of inequality, with, you see it on both ends, both extremes of our electoral campaigns over the past couple, whether it's Bernie Sanders on the left or Trump and others on the right. Like, there is a lot of political demand for attacking corruption. And on the same time, on the foreign policy side, our adversaries are now no longer held together by the ideology of communism. Instead, that's been replaced with kleptocracy and paying off loyalists. And so that is the Achilles heel, not only because of that, because that's how they'll hold together, but because their money is in the Western financial system. It's right there. So it's a real vulnerability. Back when I worked in 2016 in the White House, and before that, we were administering the Russia sanctions program, and we were struck that in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine, the Kremlin reacted, Putin reacted much more directly and viscerally to us sanctioning a handful of his crony friends than to when we sanctioned the entire Russian economy. That is really important, and it's kind of revealing about how he sees it as an existential element of his regime and ability to hold on to power. So there's a real opportunity policy-wise and politically, and I hope we take advantage of it.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, so Edward, where are we going to go in the UK? How are we going to get a grip of this problem before it runs away with it from us?
I'm not terribly optimistic, really. There was the lobbying power of the city is considerable, and we've seen repeated attempts by for example, the old the old FSA did a report on the KYC implementation of Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering rules by the banks, and highlighted some really shocking examples of overseas PEPs, persons of politically exposed persons, who were getting banking services in this country on the say-so of the chairman of the board, and being coach and horses being driven through what was supposed to be the rules. And the British Bankers Association made sure that report never got anywhere. And we occasionally see politicians saying we need to clean things up, and we're very slowly moving, for example, towards toughening the requirements at Companies House. But last time I looked, I don't know anyone who's tuned in remembers Anna Chapman, the famous Russian spy who was caught in America in 2010. Last time I checked, her fake company was still up on Companies House with the stolen personal identifying details of a British citizen who she'd borrowed for the purposes of pretending to have a company director. And when the real person who owned these details complained, Companies House said, "I'm terribly sorry, there's nothing we can do about it." So there's this extraordinary level of wetness all over the place when it comes to this. It's not impossible. I mean, I see that the British Virgin Islands is now finally going to have a public register. When I wrote a leader in The Economist demanding this in 2010, I was told by the BVI office in London that this idea was so utopian that they weren't even going to bother to respond to my request for comment. And a mere 10 years later, it's happening. So but I think one needs to get both sort of raise public outrage, which isn't really there at the moment, and apply pressure on the decision makers so it goes to the top of their agenda, and then make sure that the proposal doesn't get sabotaged by influential lobbyists. I would say the one thing that really scares people in this country is the prospect of extradition to the United States. And I've been trying quite hard through my think tank in Washington to get the Senate committees, particularly the Banking Committee and the Justice and other committees responsible, to see if they can sort of weaponize the American criminal justice system so that people involved in politicized corruption in other countries feel the cold breath of an American extradition warrant on their shoulders, because I think that would be much more intimidating than anything that at the moment we can muster in terms of prosecution in Britain. You're muted.
I'm sorry. Edward, I wanted to come back to a point in the middle of that about kind of the interest of the public at large in this issue. And there's a question from one of the attendees around exactly that. How does one get the public at large interested in the fact that actually democracy may be under attack from malign finance and from forms of electoral interference? So Edward, just how would you change that picture that you painted about the view of the public at large?
Well, I think one of the problems is that the public feels that politics is awash with money anyway, so why worry particularly about foreign money? And the more you clean up politics in general, the more conspicuous politicized dark money from abroad becomes. But I'm afraid that politics has a pretty low, its reputation is fairly dented among the public, and one needs to try and restore an expectation of integrity before you can expect people to be outraged by breaches of integrity.
Perhaps we should all be allowed to go and play a tennis match with the Prime Minister. That would encourage people. So Gemma, a question for you back on the sort of public-private partnership element. Obviously, there are a lot of initiatives around the world, particularly in big financial centres, to bring. You mentioned the gimlet in the UK, but there are plenty of others. To what extent are you, from your vantage point, and perhaps with some of the newer organisations you deal with through the FinTech FinCrime Exchange, to what extent are you seeing governments actually engaging with the private sector, educating them, and perhaps regulators enabling prioritisation? You can't have your finger in every single hole in the dike all the time as a financial institution. So help us prioritise, please. What are you seeing in that from that angle?
Yes, I think on the first point, from my vantage point, I'm seeing pretty good engagement from the likes of City of London Police, from Europol, and that definitely feels like it's very much kind of a two-way street. So on the one hand, we will have at the FFE as an example, and what I'm most familiar with, we will have sort of representatives from those organisations come and train members of that community in what is the best way to share information, what kinds of things are they looking for, what is helpful to law enforcement in particular scenarios, to make sure that that flow of information is as frictionless as possible. And then kind of vice versa, there's sort of almost not training back, but sort of awareness raising back around sort of some of these particularly sort of new financial products that are coming out, and new ways that things are set up, making sure that kind of law enforcement are really well attuned to what those products are and specifically what risks they're dealing with. I think on your sort of broader point about sort of regulators helping firms to prioritize, like I think in many places the regulatory regimes are relatively well written in the sense that they focus on a risk-based approach. And so some of it is to an extent kind of inculcated in the way in which a regulator expects firms to manage their risks. And I think that is a useful approach. I think where it needs to go in future is, yes, have that risk-based approach, but also really focus on effectiveness. And so what I get frustrated to see sometimes is where you have sort of you don't have a normal customer due diligence program in place. I'm like, well, what does normal mean? If your program works and it's in line with the risks that you face and it's targeted at combating those risks and it's doing that effectively, and you have evidence to show that it's effective, then that should be absolutely sufficient from a regulatory perspective. It shouldn't be, people have heard me speak before, hear me say this all the time, but it shouldn't be a kind of tick box approach to this type of compliance, because anti-financial crime just simply doesn't work like that. So yeah, in summary, I think the basis is there from that risk-based approach, but I think it needs to go further and focus on effectiveness so that firms can really genuinely demonstrate that they are that they're taking some of the steps in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. So look, we're coming towards the end of our hour. I think I'll ask each of you for some sort of final thoughts in a second, but one of the things that's coming through from the questions in this discussion is that, of course, we all hope for legislative change. We can see gaps that need to be filled, but we also know that legislative change, certainly in our country and in the United States as well, requires parliamentary airtime. It takes time to happen. And so I suppose where I would want to try and end this conversation is if there were 2 or 3 things that you could call for now that are actionable, that aren't going to require a vast amount of kind of horse trading and a vast amount of time, what should we hope to see over the next 12 months, regardless of what happens in the election in the United States? What would we like to see over the next 12 months from each of your vantage points, so that we perhaps can say that we've started to turn the tide against dark money and malign finance in the way we've been discussing it today? I'll go around in the same order as we've been going around all along. So Josh, I'll come to you first.
Sure. So we ordered, as I showed before, we ordered them in order of urgency and priority. So number 1 is broadening that definition of in-kind contributions so that you don't get these things of value. And then 2, human intermediaries, having campaigns need to require reporting of that. And then 3, and the one that Edward brought up as well, corporate transparency. For corporate transparency, I should maybe just expound a little bit that there is also a really good idea that Edward, I think you mentioned around the UK's Register of Overseas Entities, so that you can go beyond just requiring disclosure of your own, but if any overseas entity wants to be able to purchase property within the country, then they need to disclose their beneficial ownership. That's a great idea, and I like it. And both that and having a public type of registry like Companies House are good longer term goals for us in the United States. But I have to say that in order to make progress in that direction, what you would be able to expect under any politics over the next year or so in the United States is a non-public registry. We have to do that first. And if we start talking about public, then you're just going to scare the side that is worried about that. So we've got to get beneficial ownership done. That's like on close to the end zone in the Senate right now. And actually, we could frankly do something similar on real estate that would require beneficial ownership diligence around any purchases of real estate by any entities, including internationally, by simply repealing the exemption that the U.S. real estate industry has to the Section 3 of the Patriot Act, which would then require them to have, them being all the agents within the real estate sector have AML programs. So there's a lot that we can do, and everything that we put forward in our report is all, like I said, kicked the tires on both sides of the aisle. So it should be able to do on a bipartisan basis. There's a lot we can do. The last thing I'll say is that, of course, as I said before, the hard part is getting the politics right and getting both sides to understand it's a national security issue.
Thank you, Josh. Edward.
Yeah, I agree with everything Josh has said, and a lot of this is sort of more medium term. In the very short term, there's a bit of our MI5 called JSTAT, which was avowed earlier this year, although it's been in existence for a few years previously, which is the bit of government which is meant to look at hostile state activity. And I would task JSTAT with working on dark money in British politics, with all the capabilities that both GCHQ and SIS have added to what is already there in Thames House in MI5. And I would say that JSTAT has to work with the chief whips of all the main parties about penetration of Westminster and rethinking how we do security clearances and what about attempts to compromise MPs with money, and also with the treasurers of all the political parties, and make it clear this is an absolutely cross-party thing. It's not particularly a Tory problem. It's not particularly a Scottish National Party. It's not particularly Lib Dems. All the parties have had problems with dirty money, and they will all benefit from not having to play that game. So I think that would be establishing a cross-party consensus and pushing hard on that. I think we could also just, through Five Eyes plus international cooperation, start working out some rules on things like saying that shell companies can't buy real estate, they actually also can't sell real estate, and they can't rent real estate out. And this would immediately make it much less attractive to have a shell company. One could also say that shell company property, unless the beneficial ownership is disclosed within a period of, say, 1 or 2 years, then reverts to the Treasury. And that's a large lump of free money for the Treasury, which the public would be very pleased about. And of course, if the people behind the shell companies want to complain about that, then they would have to identify themselves, in which case the shell companies would no longer be shell companies. But I think we need some really bold thinking and get some momentum going. And then as the momentum grows, a lot of these seemingly insoluble problems start becoming a lot more soluble.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Gemma.
Yeah, so I think I would second those points from Edward and Josh, particularly the point on the use of JSTAT. I'm not familiar with the new name, but yeah, that part of government, I think that would be a really, really powerful tool to have at our disposal. And ultimate beneficial ownership, absolutely. I think the piece I would really just stress again is this notion of kind of information sharing. I genuinely believe that is how we're going to tackle some of these schemes, because without it, with money flows through lots of different organizations, and once you hit the end point of a transaction, then it moves outside of your own financial institution, it's impossible really to see where that money has gone on to, or where it has, sort of come from in the first place. So I think that's absolutely vital. And then, yeah, I think I would just reiterate the point I made earlier about compliance officers seeing themselves not just as kind of arbiters of regulation, but also as kind of threat intelligence analysts, and really kind of understanding the different nature of threats that exist out there, and how their teams contribute and can contribute hugely to combating those threats. I think you might be muted, Tom.
Yeah, I was muted, sorry. That's twice. That's 2 drinks I have to buy somebody for talking on mute during a webinar. Well, look, thank you all very much. I'm just going to put up a final slide. I'm going to, I thought of sort of 3 points as we were going through this. It seems to me as though there is an open question as to the extent to which we really understand the problem. Where is the money coming from? Are we collecting intelligence on it? And all of that, and that feels to me like something that can be addressed within the structures that we have already. Although there is a question around the resourcing we have, I sometimes worry that large open economies like ours resource themselves to deal with the problem as if we were a closed economy and don't think about the threats that come from externally. But I think the last thing in all of this is leadership. It really is leadership, and as I think as some of us have talked about before, we had some leadership certainly in the UK at the time of David Cameron. It started to move the dial a bit on this topic, but obviously that feels as though it's waned. And indeed, Josh, you put up some interesting photographs of leadership, individuals hugging the current Prime Minister, who perhaps he shouldn't have been hugging when it comes to money. So I think that's something that we certainly would want to see more of. So with all that, thank you all very much for joining us. If you want to follow our work, I've just put some details up there on the slide of our Twitter and mailing list. But thank you to attendees for joining us. Thank you to the RUSI colleagues behind the scene who have produced today's event. And of course, thank you very much to Josh Rudolph, Edward Lucas, and Gemma Rogers for their contributions. And a last plug for Josh's paper. If you haven't read it, then do take the time after what you've heard here today. Thank you all very much. Have a good afternoon and all stay well. Bye for now.